got to flip that on. Okay, here we are. Thank you very much, Carlos, for that kind introduction. I'm really excited to be here. It's an opportunity of a lifetime to come to Colombia for the very first time and to share with all of you some thoughts that I've built up over the last few years about life and learning. I'm going to start by breaking a rule. I have a speaker coach, and I work with her to help me figure out how not to be petrified every time I walk on stage. And she tells me that I should never start a talk by introducing myself and talking about myself. Who I am, she tells me, is not the important part. It's the topic that I'm here to discuss that we should be paying attention to. But in this particular case, who I am is really very important to the topic that I came to talk with you all about. So I'm going to have to share just a little bit about me. Let's see. Does it work this time? Oh, no, now it doesn't. Or am I holding it backwards? There it goes. Yay. Okay. So this is me today. I'm 54 years old. I have been working as a software engineer now for about 20 years, or I've been working in software engineering. I started out as an engineer. I worked my way towards management. I've been doing that for about 5 or 6 years now. I work for Amazon Web Services. I'm kind of at, I think, probably the pinnacle of my career. I can't imagine working for a place that's bigger than AWS is. And it's a great career. I've really enjoyed it. But it's not who I started out trying to be. Whoops, wrong direction. There we go. Okay, this is 1992 me. I'm 22 years old. I've been playing jazz trumpet for about 8 years at this point, and I'm starting to make just a little bit of money at it. I'm in college and I'm studying music composition. In about a year from now, I'm going to graduate. And after I graduate, I'm going to head off to China, and I'll be studying music in China for a couple of years. I've written a couple of lines of computer code at this point using a program that's made for music called C-Sound, but it's really, really slow. You write your code, you press a button, you wait an hour or two, and then you come back and what you hear is, and you think, oh, that was very disappointing. So it's clunky, and I don't like it very much. And being a software engineer is absolutely the furthest thing from my mind in this picture here. I'm going to continue down this road for a couple of more years. I'll come home from China. I'll enroll in a master's degree program in composition. I'm going to buy my very first personal computer with a whopping 8 gigabyte hard drive in 1997. And I'm going to start to learn at that point Lisp in order to write some of my music. It won't be until about 2000 that I head to Seattle. I start working on my PhD for composition that I begin to look ahead of me and wonder, is this really the life that I want for myself? And around 2003, I made the decision that no, it's not the life that I wanted for myself. And I left it, and I began working professionally as a web developer. So, for the first half of my life, from about 1994 or so till about 2003, maybe 1984 to 2003, maybe 19 years, I spent my life as a musician. First I was a performer, then I became a composer. And I was only 33, or I was already 33 by the time I left that life and began working as a software engineer. It's a lot of time, 20 years, to spend doing something that you don't end up doing with the rest of your life. But here's the thing. I don't think that time was actually wasted at all. As I've gone on through my career as a software engineer, I've come to realize that there are lessons that I learned in this earlier part of my life that are useful to me now. There are patterns of behavior, there are ways of thinking, there are perspectives that I first found when I was in music that shape who I am now and the way that I look at software engineering, the way that I practice the craft of software engineering, the way that I teach it to others, and the way that I lead teams now that I'm in management. Who I was then is a big part of who I am now. And I think that this is true for all of us. Every one of us here in this room has the same feature. Many of you may have started in some other career other than software development, but even if you came straight to software engineering out of your student life, you probably have other interests, other passions that carry you, that are part of your lives. And it's those jobs, those interests, and those passions that have taught you lessons that you may not even be aware of. And I believe that if we can bring those lessons to our conscious practice as software engineers, it makes us better at our jobs. And I think that if we all are able to bring these lessons together, then our teams function more strongly. We're able to work together in ways that are much more than we can do if we only bring the lessons that we've learned as engineers. So I want to spend the time that we have here today talking about some of these lessons that I learned and the ways in which they've shaped the work that I do today. My first lesson is one that I picked up pretty early in my life as a musician, and understanding it helped me to grow faster and to go farther than I ever would have had I been on my own. The lesson is that I always learned the most when I was the least skilled person on the stage. My first paying job as a jazz musician came when I was about 15. I'd been working with a professional trumpet player as my teacher. He had a job, he had a big band that he was leading in Denver that played a weekly gig at a bar that liked to have big band jazz in it. And one of his trumpet players quit. He knew I was really interested, and he offered me the job of being the fourth chair trumpet player in this band. And of course, I jumped on the opportunity. I was in pretty far over my head, to be really honest. Everyone else in the band was a grown-up. Here I was, this little kid, playing next to all these big people who'd been playing for years, and they all knew exactly what they were doing. I felt overwhelmed by the experience. But because I was so far behind everyone else, I learned an enormous amount. I had to work extra hard just to keep up with them. And I really ended up picking up an incredible amount in a very short period of time. And the truth is that music is a cooperative venture. Nobody in that band wanted me to fail. They all wanted me to succeed. The reason being that if I failed, the band would sound terrible. They didn't want that. And so I ended up finding myself surrounded by teachers who were ready to share with me everything that I needed to learn in order to become a fully functioning member of that group. So as I progressed in my music life, I tried to keep this same thing going. I tried always to be the least skilled person on the stage, and it worked pretty well for me. I ended up reaching places and playing with people that I would never have imagined myself being able to do because of the education I got from the people that I surrounded myself with. I became the very best that I was capable of being. Things started just a little bit differently when I first moved into software. I was hired by this group here, the Continuing Medical Education Department at the University of Washington. The reason they gave me the job was because 80% or so of the job was setting up electronic equipment in order to run medical teleconferences and conferences and things like that, cameras and audio gear. And I'd been working for years in music studios, and I knew how to deal with all of the electronics. If there were problems, I knew how to solve them. I knew how to figure out what was wrong. But the other 20% of the job was making a website. And I knew just enough HTML to claim that I could do that part of the job too. But there was still a great deal that I had to learn. So I bought a book. And I read that book from cover to cover. And I built myself a website that worked reasonably well. But the thing was that everything that I learned from that one source. If there was a vibrant PHP community somewhere, I didn't know where it was. And I didn't know how to find it. So between the book and the PHP 5 language specifications that I found online, I stumbled along and I learned little by little to get better. After a couple of years at that job, I moved on to this one here, which was the Department of Radiology, still at the University of Washington. The first job that I had there was to pick a content management system that they would use in order to build their new website. I chose the Plone CMS. Plone was written in Python, and that was a language that I'd never worked with before. I'd written Lisp and PHP at this point. But Plone had a prominent link on their website to this thing called IRC, which I'd never heard of. I clicked on the link and up popped a little web interface to IRC, and I was talking with other people who were using the software. I was able to chat directly with them. But more than that, I was able to talk with a number of the people who'd actually written the software that I was using. And the thing that was really great was that they were friendly, and they were helpful. One feature that I needed for my radiology site was a directory for faculty and staff and graduate students. And I had this idea that if I added a person to that directory, it would give them the ability to log into the website. And they could then see pages that were private, only for people who were inside the website. And if I put them into a specific division within radiology, then they'd get that same kind of permission only for sections of that website. And they'd be able to add and edit pages, but only the ones that belonged to them and to their division. There was this great plugin, faculty staff directory, that already existed, and it would let me create the directory and put people into divisions and make all the listings and put pictures on them, and very attractive. It was really nice to work with, but it didn't support any of the login or access control stuff that I was really interested in using. Still, there was IRC, and in addition to the Plone Web IRC channel, there was one for this group called WebLion, which was an organization at Penn State University, and they were the ones who'd actually created this plugin in the first place. I asked them about it, and they said, well, yeah, actually, that sounds like a great idea. We'd be very interested in it, but there's all these other things that we're working on. Maybe you could do it yourself. And so I got my first chance to make an open source contribution. The folks at WebLion and in the Plone IRC channels were great programmers. More than that, they were interested in community and collaboration, and they were willing to help a newbie like myself get better and learn what I needed to know in order to make that first contribution successful. The WebLion folks even invited me to come to this conference that they held each year for Plone. It was called the Plone Symposium East. And when I attended my very first one in 2007, I ended up learning about one of my favorite features of the Python community sprints. At my very first sprint, which I attended at that Plone Symposium, I got to sit down with the folks that I had been working with in IRC. Now, it's one thing to chat with an expert online and have them give you information, but it's another thing entirely to watch them do the work that they do. The difference in speed and facility and skill between myself and these people that I was sitting next to was absolutely terrifying to me. I was shocked. But I learned new tools, I learned keyboard shortcuts, I learned dozens of helpful little Python tricks that helped to make me get better at the thing that I was trying to do. Now, the Plone community has this tradition of sprinting in order to make progress on projects that they share as a community with each other. They'll bring people together into a single place, and everybody will focus in and work on some feature for some product that they want to put together. After I attended this one, the No Fun Zopskel Barbecue Sprint in 2009, the folks who were running it offered me the chance of becoming the maintainer for this package. The previous maintainer had decided that he didn't want to do the job anymore, and they saw that I was interested. They gave me the chance, and it became the next step in my contributions to the community. Sprints remain to this day my favorite part of the Python community. It's amazing to me that professionals who work so hard at their jobs will take extra time, get together, work with people, bring newcomers into the community and help level their skills up. It's just a fantastic thing. And I continue to attend every one that I can because it's the best way that I know to learn your craft. So with a little updating, this lesson from my life in music turned out to serve me really well as I learned how to be an engineer. And I encourage all the engineers that I work with and lead to take the same approach. Our community has such a great tradition of working together cooperatively that there are many opportunities to surround yourself with people who know more than you do and are willing to share. It's really easy to make yourself the least skilled person in the room. As I grew into my role as a software engineer, I got more comfortable standing on my own. I began having to make decisions about the code that I was writing, and my next lesson came in handy more than once. The lesson is, in order to have one, you must first have two. Now, that's a little abstract. So let me start by showing how it applied in the world of music. Now, if you're a drummer, or perhaps if you know one, you might recognize this. It's the music notation for a single strike of a drum. There are no drums in the room today, I don't think. If you happen to bring one, please feel free to pull it out. But we're going to make this represent a clap, like so. And we in this room, all of us together, are going to play this piece of music, okay? So what's going to happen here is I'm going to make this music notation disappear. It will go away. When it reappears, I want all of you to clap once, like that. Can you do that? Let's try it. Okay, good. Here we go. Ready? Okay, not bad. I have a question for you, though. How fast is this music? Do we know? Before you answer the question, let's try another piece together. Now we have two claps in a row. And again, we're going to play this music together. I'm going to make the notation disappear, and when it reappears, I want each of you in the room to clap twice. Are you ready? Okay. Oh my God. The way I had planned this, you would all make different decisions about when to clap that second time, and yet you didn't. I don't know what it is. Maybe you were all listening to the same music on the radio when you came in this morning, or maybe it's that da-da-da-da-da-da that we've been listening to every morning. But the point is that the decision about when we make that second clap is important. As soon as we have a second note to play, we get a tempo. And tempo is the word that musicians use to describe the speed of a piece of music. It's measured in beats per minute. So if a piece of music has a tempo of 60, there are 60 beats in a minute, or 1 beat every second. If it has a tempo of 100, there's 100 beats in a minute, or 1 beat every 0.6 seconds or so. But there can only be a tempo when you have more than one note. In order to have one tempo, you must have two notes. Let's take another example here. This is an A. Let me find it on my little pitch pipe here. Nope, that's C. Here we are. Sounds like that. It's a nice note. Has a frequency of about 440 hertz a second. But by itself, it doesn't mean a whole lot. In order to gain some meaning, we have to add other pitches around it. Now, we have two notes. The second one is a B flat. It's a half step away from the A. And half steps in music are important because the two notes are much closer together than normal. Because they're closer together, they tend to pull towards each other, either upwards, or rather, upwards like this, or downwards like that, or upwards like this. Half steps are valuable to music. They help us to gain context that will provide understanding about the role that each one of these pitches is going to play in our piece of music. Music in the European tradition uses a set of pitches that has two whole half steps, only two of them. And knowing where each one of them is helps us to understand the context of the music that we're going to play. So with this one half step, we don't really have enough context to understand that. We need to add a couple more notes. Now we have two half steps. One of them pulls down, and the other one pulls up. This inward collapsing movement forms what in music we call a cadence, which is a progression from one chord to another, where the second one is always in the home key. Speaking of which, because of this cadence, we now understand that we're in the key of B flat major. So, we begin to understand, with the more notes that we add, the context of the music that we're going to play, where each one of the notes lies, the relationships they have with each other, and which ones are going to be the home ones. This means that we get to understand the key that we're in. Like tempo, key is an important concept in music. It controls the relationships between pitches, and it gives meaning to the music that we have. In the Western tradition, key is very important. Major keys are happy, minor keys are sad, and so on and so forth. So in the world of music, we have a couple of examples here of how, in order to have one, we first have to have two. But why does this matter to all of you in this room? You're probably thinking, I didn't come here for a music lesson. I don't really know what you're talking about. But as it turns out, this was actually important in my music life. I spoke already a little bit about this first engineering job that I had at continuing medical education. It was here that I built my first dynamic website. And as part of that website, there was a chapter in my book that was about building a login system so that you could allow people to log into your website. I followed the book, and I ended up with something that worked really well. But as I worked on the site more and more, and I began to extend it past what was in the book, what I began to realize was that the way that that login system was built, although it was suited very well for the one purpose it had originally been intended for, the more purposes I tried to fit it to, the less suited it became. It was my first introduction in the world of software engineering to the idea of generalization. It didn't occur to me until I tried to use this same thing in more than one place that it was possible to build something that could be used in a multitude of places, or that there was a reason why the thing you built wouldn't have worked that way. As engineers, we often face problems just like this. We are hired to build software in order to solve problems. And it turns out that many of the problems that we face are the same problem, or they're substantially similar to each other. As we grow as engineers, we begin to realize this, and we start to think that perhaps we could design software that would be suited to solve an entire class of problems. It's how we end up with people who build libraries or frameworks. But it's in this moment that you first start to think that you could build a generalized system, that my lesson from music becomes important. As an engineer, pretty much every time I faced a new problem, I would start to think, hey, I could generalize this. I might think of ways that the software could be used in the future, or that other people might want to use it. I'd try to generalize to meet those use cases, but the thing was, most of the time, I was absolutely dead wrong about what I thought people would want to do with the software that I was writing. Now, this should not have surprised me, but it did. The fact is, there are millions of things that someone might want to do with a piece of software, and there were only a few things that I myself could think of. So it's kind of a wonder that I was ever right in the choices that I made. It's very hard to predict the future, but it is not as hard to look back and see what came before. For a number of years, I worked with this team at Jazzcarta. They were a web dev shop that was focused on open source work. We built websites and applications using tools like Plone and Django and Pyramid. And all of these tools support user authentication and access controls. Each one of them has generalized those tools in a different way. But there's also another interesting difference between the first two of these tools and the third one. Plone, which was first released in 2001, and Django, which first came out in 2005, are both the first systems of their kind that were built by the people who built them. Pyramid, on the other hand, was built by some people who had done it several times before. It was their second or third or even fourth system. And for me, when I use these tools, I can actually feel that difference. In each of them, you can absolutely accomplish the things that you want to do when it comes to authentication and user access. But I've found that when I use Pyramid, I end up spending less of my time fighting the framework. The generalizations of that framework are a better fit to a wider variety of use cases. And I don't know if the creators would agree, but I believe that the reason for this is because they have built many of these kinds of systems before, and they've built more context for themselves around the kinds of situations in which such a tool is going to be used. It gave them the ability to make better choices about their generalizations and build a piece of software that was going to work just a little bit better. So building a specific kind of tool twice or even more times can help us to get enough context to truly understand what it is that we are building. Without that additional context, or with that additional context, we can make better choices, we can make better generalizations, and the systems and tools that we built are stronger and more usable as a result. I learned this lesson first in music, but it's been very helpful in reminding me to let time and repetition tell me what I need. So my first lesson helped me to learn how to be an engineer, and my second taught me to be patient about understanding the potential of the code that I'm writing. My third lesson has helped me to remember that my ultimate goal as a software engineer is to produce working solutions to real-world problems. The lesson is to know when to stop. As a composer, the idea for a piece of music would come into mind kind of misty. I would have some ideas about what I wanted. Sometimes I'd get these little flashes of clarity in which I could hear a portion of the music exactly the way that I imagined that it would be. So I'd reach for it, I'd work, I'd try to pull that thing out of my imagination and put it out into the real world, but no matter how hard I tried, it always ended up being just a little different than I had imagined it to be. There was always a gap between what I wanted and what I got. And as an artist, I needed to learn to accept this. I was never going to be able to be satisfied with what I made. I had to move on to the next thing. If I didn't, we can end up creating a monster. Take, for example, the album Chinese Democracy by the band Guns N' Roses. The first tracks for this album were laid down in 1998, maybe 2 years after their previous album was released. But Axl Rose was super picky about what he wanted. He was constantly changing musicians, changing producers, changing engineers, and 10 years and $13 million later, he finally released the album, only to have critics say, it's okay, I guess. The Chinese have a saying about this. The saying is, 画蛇添足, which literally translated means draw a snake and add legs. The saying comes from a story from the Warring States period. Those are the 3 centuries that led up to 221 BC, when the Qin Empire finally took over all of China and made it a unified country. The story goes that the master of a house wanted to thank his servants for helping him prepare for an important ceremony, so he gave them a jug of wine. But there were many servants and only one jug of wine, so the servants decided that they would have a contest to figure out who was going to win the wine. That's hard to say, win the wine. Anyway, the contest that they decided on was that they were going to draw a snake. And the first one who finished drawing his snake would win the bottle of wine, the jug. They launched into it, and the first servant finished the job. He looked around him, he realized everybody else was still drawing, so he thought to himself, ha, I've got this. And he drew legs onto his snake to make it better. When the second servant finished, he reached for the wine, but the first one said, I finished first. I should get the wine. The second one looked at his picture and said, you idiot. Snakes don't have legs. What you've drawn is clearly not a snake, and so therefore you have clearly not won the jug of wine. It belongs to me, and he took it. The servant learned an important lesson that day, which was when to stop. As a jazz musician, this was one of the hardest lessons that I ever had to learn. Improvising doesn't set rules for how long a solo should be. As long as I had ideas, I could keep playing. But it turns out that it isn't really a very good idea to continue playing on and on and on and on until people get tired of listening to you. And solo should have a shape. There should be like a rise and a fall or some kind of a vector of change that you play that keeps the audience interested and leads them somewhere. If you stop too soon, you fail to reach that climax, reach that point, and the audience is left unsatisfied for some reason. If you go too far, then you pass that peak. You get past the point where you're pulling, and you begin to pull energy out of the performance. Your audience is left flat. They wish you were done. The same problem happens in composition. Finding the right end for a piece is much, much harder than filling in the parts in the middle. You start with a theme or an idea, and you build a piece by taking that idea and changing it through time, altering it, twisting it, turning it into something else. But when is the end? There's a shape that you want to complete, a rise and a fall or a vector or something like that. At any point, in any case, at some point you have to decide that you've reached the end. And if you do it too early or too late, it's just not quite right. I have a good example of this from my own work. During my work on my doctorate, I got fascinated with this idea of minimal compositions. They were little things. I would make them out of a single sampled sound, and I'd twist and bend and change that sound and put it together in ways that would make a piece of music. Now, I'm going to use this term loosely. We're going to have an example here of this. I want you all to understand that you should not expect a beat or something that you can dance to. The first piece that I built out of this was called Splattercast. It's made out of a single sampled sound of a rubber band. Everything that's in the piece comes from that one sound. I built a little engine using this Lisp music program that I had been learning how to use that would shape random numbers and use those random numbers to choose how fast or slow the music was going, where the pitches would change, the ways that I would compress or filter that sound, and then took the phrases that the engine generated and combined them together into gestures that made the piece of music. And it worked really well. Now, if I had stopped right there, I think the piece would have been perfect. It's got a fire to it. There's this kinetic energy. It hits that first end, and it's really tight and tidy. But I was not satisfied, and I decided I needed to add just a little bit more. So in the end, I think I went a little too far. The dog liked it, but the truth is that that first gesture has punch, it has power. The rest of it pulls away from that. It dilutes the impact of the music. When I moved into software development, I found that there were some similarities to my music life. I was still working in an abstract space. Nothing that I created was physically real, but I was still making things. And oftentimes, I was making something that I'd never made before. It was challenging for me to learn where the edges of a project were supposed to be. I'd have requirements and specifications, but I could also see possibilities and chances. If I just add this feature, I know the customer's going to love it. If I put a hook in this place in the software, I'll be able to extend it in the future in some really cool ways. My customers also changed their minds. They'd ask for one thing, but really want something else. Scope creep is a real phenomenon. An old friend of mine from back when I worked with WebLion, Eric Rose, wrote and maintains this wonderful little Python library called More Iter Tools, along with a guy named Bo Bales. And like all library maintainers, they face this same kind of problem every day. There's always another feature request from somebody, always something more that their library could do. If they say yes to every request, then accept every contribution, it risks diluting the library so it becomes confusing or overbroad, or making it so complex that it becomes unusable. A tool that does everything isn't particularly well suited to any specific thing. But if they say no to the wrong feature, then they risk missing an important facet of possibility for their library. No one can imagine all the ways in which their software might be used. They need contributions in order to keep the library relevant to a broad selection of users. They can't reject all of their contributions and expect anyone to participate in their open source project. It's a balancing act, an art, and it takes time and experience to learn it well, the way that they have. So the art of engineering is understanding when a thing is done. Sometimes it's knowing when to let go, even if you know that there's more to do, done enough for now. This lesson is particularly hard to learn for most of us because we are, in some sense, perfectionists. We can see the flaws in the things that we make immediately upon having made them. But after I left the University of Washington, I went into business for myself. After a couple years of open source development, I took on a contract teaching Python for this company called Codefellows. They served people who wanted to switch from one career into another. I had a reasonable example of doing that, and so it was a good job for me. They asked me to develop a Python course that would help people to make this transition. And I was given a blank canvas of 10 weeks to fill with everything that I thought an engineer might need to know in order to become employable. I felt that the core skill of understanding when to stop and move on to the next thing was one of the most important things an engineer could learn, and so I designed the course to teach it. We built a simple HTTP server from Python sockets. We built a basic learning journal using Pyramid Web Framework. We built an image management website using Django. We learned about how to make mashups using APIs from different open sources. We learned protocols like TCP/IP and HTTP and SMTP and IMAP and all of them. We even worked our way through all of the classic data structures and algorithms, linked lists, queues, graphs, tries, trees. It was more than any sane person should attempt to learn in 10 weeks, and not a single student ever finished every assignment in the course. But that was the point. In order to pass the course, you only needed to get 80% of the assignments done. The lesson, and the thing that I kept trying to remind the students every day was, you don't need it perfect, you need it finished. Finish what you're working, move on to the next thing. They needed to learn how to say, this is good enough, it's time to move on. This was a lesson that I'd learned the hard way in music, and it was a lesson that I had to relearn every single time I had a job as a software engineer. I could never complete anything the way that I really wanted it to be. And if you are employed as a software engineer, then I'm imagining that you probably don't either. We all learn to know when to stop. So my last lesson for the day is about developing habits that support advanced engineering work. I learned this lesson first as I grew into a professional musician, but it's still very useful to me today. Building skills requires focused practice. My first instrument was the piano. I was a little older than this guy, but still I was pretty young. I started by playing tiny little pieces of music, 4 measures, just a few notes. I don't remember what any of them were, but my wife is a piano teacher today, and she has a first book that she gives to students. It has tiny pieces like, hey diddle diddle, D's in the middle, C's on the bottom, and E's on top, or 3 black cats, then 2, play a song for you. The purpose of these small songs is to help students learn basic skills they're going to need, what the notes are called, where their hands belong on the keyboard, what proper hand position is, so on. Because the pieces are very short and very easy, you can practice them from beginning to end, and this was the way that I would do it. Repeat them over and over until you've got them perfect, and then you're done. My early years on the trumpet were spent doing the same sort of thing. Tiny little pieces that were meant to help me understand how to produce a sound, what the notes were called, how to make the change from one sound to another smoothly, and I practiced them in the same way, from beginning to end, repeat until perfect. But as I grew as a musician, the pieces I played got longer and longer and more involved and more difficult. It was possible to still try to practice them from one end to the other, but it became much less effective. When I tried to do that, I ended up practicing the mistakes. This is a thing that musicians call out, practicing the mistakes. My wife loves this term. The problem is when you play an instrument, you're using your body to play that instrument. And when you practice, your body learns the motions that it's going to make. We call this muscle memory. And muscle memory is great for keeping something in your head forever. Think about riding a bicycle, right? You know what they say, once you learn how to ride a bike, you never forget, right? But it's a dangerous thing if you are practicing mistakes. Once body memory, muscle memory, has brought those mistakes into you, it's incredibly difficult to get them to go away. So instead, what I learned to do was to take a piece apart, phrase by phrase, sometimes even measure by measure, and perfect each individual part on its own. For example, this phrase, which comes from the Hummel Trumpet Concerto, the opening movement, we could possibly take the whole thing from end to end, but in truth, when you break it down, there's some tricky parts in here, and it's well worth the time as a musician to take it apart and study each one of those individual pieces on its own. So first, as a trumpet player, I'd focus on this part. It's only 3 notes. But the truth is, those first 2 notes are an octave apart, and hitting 2 notes on a trumpet that are an octave apart cleanly is actually difficult. It takes agility in your lip muscles. So it's going to take a little while to practice these throw notes and get it to the point where I can punch each one of them solidly and not flub a single one. Next, I'd go back to the start, and I'd focus on building some energy through that trill that happens on beat number 3 up into the peak of the phrase, that A that's at the top there. This time, I'd focus on that energy. Even though the whole phrase is meant to be quiet, you still want to build some interest. You want to build something through that carries you up to that peak. Next, of course, we'd move to this middle part, but here I'd actually try something that can also be helpful, which is to start at the end and work backwards. I'd begin with these 3 notes, and I'd work by playing them until I could do them 10 times in a row without a mistake. Then I'd back up another beat and add this part. This time, instead of just focusing on the pitches, I could also concentrate on that little crescendo that makes you get louder until you hit the C. Then I'd work on playing the whole bit together, staying soft until that second measure starts and then growing up into the C. And finally, I would take each of those individual pieces that I'd practice and I'd combine them together and play the whole phrase, building energy up to the peak, carrying that energy down through the crescendo into those final notes and hitting them cleanly and solidly. This kind of focused practice is how professional musicians work. As you get better at your instrument, you learn to look at a piece of music and see immediately the parts of it that are going to be the most difficult. You pull those parts out, you focus in on them, you get them done, and once they're perfect, you move towards the rest of the piece and putting the whole thing together. When I was first dating the woman who became my wife, this was the way that she would practice. She was preparing for her master's recital. And while I sat in the living room of her apartment, working on my studies, I would listen to her rehearse the music that she was going to be playing. She'd play phrases, measures, over and over and over again, working on bringing out the right finger, the right voice, making sure everything was clean and clear and voiced correctly. And it wasn't until months later, when she finally actually performed the recital, that I heard her play the entire thing from end to end. Never once before that had I heard all of the music. So I walked into the recital a little nervous. She's a nice girl. I like her a lot. But what is this going to be like? I sat down, and she began playing, and it was amazing. It was the first time that I'd ever heard her play something all the way through, and it was a revelation. She was such a fantastic musician. I knew then what you all know now, which is that she was going to be my wife. So we've talked about this group at WebLion before. They were the team that I worked with to make that first open source contribution to faculty staff directory back when I was just getting started in the Python world. Over the years, I got to be friends with the folks from WebLine, and one of them went on to be the release manager for the Plone content management system. One day, he tweeted this: "I'm going to make it my goal for 2013 to find a legitimate use for every one of the methods in the Python itertools library." I loved this idea, and I decided that I was going to try it out for myself. So I'd be working on some problem, and I'd find a function from Python's standard library somewhere that helped me, or maybe I'd be reading a code review from someone else, and I'd see a function I'd never used before, and I'd reach out to try to figure out what it did. I would look up that module, that function, in the module that it belonged to in this tool here, the Python module of the week. It's one